been saying. And although that will undoubtedly be even more boring than usual, I'm doing it for two reasons. One is that I haven't been able to continue with what I was talking about because I've had to do a piece of work in preparation for a conference that's been given in Philadelphia in April called Models of Psychotherapy. And I realized when I got a letter from the man who convened the thing that I was supposed to produce some sort of document. And so I started to write the document. And then when I got writing the document, I didn't continue what I was doing. So I'm going to give you this document, at least most of it. And many of you have not had an opportunity or invitation, whatever, to be here throughout the whole course of things. So in a sense, this is a sort of a summary, and maybe it will serve some purpose. I hope also that you will feel free to interrupt, perhaps more than you usually do, to help me with this thing. All the different people at this conference are supposed to give about a half-hour's account of the way they think psychotherapeutic work should be organized. And Otto Kernberg is going to give one, and Hans Struck, and the head of the Jungian Institute in Philadelphia, somebody from New York Psychoanalytic. So that the thing is meant to be fairly broad-gauged, I assume. And I'm going to read most of this. Well, much of it is repetitious. I start out by saying that I believe that the prevailing model of psychodynamic psychotherapy has been an educative model. And I quote now from Lawrence Friedman in New York. The therapist enlightens the patient's ego about the nature of reality, and the ego then molds the patient's impulses to conform with that reality. The nature of reality is something to be observed and agreed upon. And the epigenesis of impulse, too, has a normal course, which is to be noted and accepted in this prevailing view of psychotherapy. Now, of course, there have been a great many differences of opinion about the pace and place of interpretation, the role of transference and countertransference, the centrality of genetic reconstruction, the types of cases suitable, the importance of the parameters, so-called, that is, the ancillary methods for scientific interpretation. I think it's safe to say that there has gradually been a considerable broadening out of the cases thought suitable, and increasing courage to interpret, especially to interpret the transference. But the central principle has remained an educative one, making the patient see. While this remains the prevailing view, the model has been under attack from two broad directions, I suggest. It is also my impression that this attack has been increasingly persuasive, to the point where we have begun to replace the educative model. And I mean to show what I think is one form of that replacement. The first attack has been on the idea of a fixed external reality, which imprints itself on the ego. On the ego as the central agency of change, and on the idea of an established course of the impulses. Indeed, as is well known, there has even been an extensive attack on the centrality of the history of impulse, as opposed to the history of selfhood, and that this has come from within psychoanalysis itself. The educative model presumes a teacher with authority, a body of established truth, and forms or rituals of learning. All these are well known to us. Of course, it is inevitable that there should also have been other teachers with different truths and different procedures, but they only reinforce the idea of psychotherapy as learning. What is new and what constitutes a formidable attack on the fundamental model is the emergence, or the traditional model, is the emergence of a different and systematic ideas of the process of change. These have been there have been three in my life of these, of the principal sources of these. The first is the oldest. It predates psychodynamic psychiatry itself. And in its influence on psychotherapy, the most recent. This is the disease school. Powered by pharmacology, brain chemistry, and physics, it has had a great resurgence and replaces psychoanalysis as the reigning power in American psychiatry. Any model of psychotherapy must today include the findings of the disease school, for the simple reasons that many symptom clusters are recognizable, some are responsive to drug treatment, and few such treatments are incompatible with the psychotherapeutic process. It's hard to see why any other point of view falls short of malpractice. The other two threats to the traditional view of psychotherapy come from existential psychiatry on the one hand and social, interpersonal, and family psychiatry on the other. These are not always easy to identify, in part because each has been taken up into the traditional view and used in the traditional ways. For example, both Greenson and Kohut were workers plainly in the existential line, and yet that line has often been hidden in psychoanalytic language. Similarly, the family workers include those who work psychoanalytically, existentially, and in mixtures of ways, so that pure lines are hard to follow. I think it is worth attempting to follow some pure lines, however, if only briefly, because their impact on psychotherapy has been so great, and because any new model of psychotherapy must take them seriously into account. Now, all this will be very repetitious to you. The existential quest is for the conscious experience of the other, of course. The existential worker wants to see not the patient himself or his mental content, but what the patient himself sees. He is to be with the other, as we say. The investigative goal is therefore this other's experience. The therapeutic goal is whatever the patient wants, and its tools are being with, sharing, and the results of the encounter. While the quest for fantasies and feelings dominate psychoanalysis and existential psychiatry respectively, the goal of social psychiatry is the facts. In Sullivan's words, what you would have seen if you'd been there. This restores to psychiatry what used to be called historical truth, the past reconstructed from documents and witnesses. The great workers have been Sullivan himself, Adelaide Johnson, and some of the family therapists. The principal tools, therapeutic tools, have been this historical reconstruction and transference management. I believe that much of behaviorism belongs here too. I suggest it's possible to view the work of the four great psychiatric schools in a simple way. Each, I suggest, makes use of, develops, and refines a central psychological function. I'm also going to suggest that our model of psychotherapy should incorporate all these psychological functions. The disease school, or objective descriptive psychiatry, is above all the work of perception. Kraepelin looked for signs, collected them into syndromes, looked again for the syndromes, followed their emergence over even decades. He was a great portraitist, painting out of his vast experience, and so faithfully are these portraits that we can recognize them to this day. And of course, he had so extraordinarily few ideas, Kraepelin. In contrast, Freud's work was the work of the head. It is no accident that his materials were ideas, words, fantasies, always mental constructions, fed into and themselves constituting by a kind of mental metabolism the extraordinary body of his theories. And just as the Kraepelinian psychiatrist recognizes a disease entity and then attempts to affect it by medication or instruction, Freud interpreted and explained to his subjects an intellectual or cognitive task. Much of interpersonal psychiatry seems the work of the hand. At least that word and function is suggested by the other words like handle, manage, manipulate, so characteristic of Sullivan's interventions. The Latin root of manage and manipulate is manus, which means hand. The observer here participates. Observing alone, as in descriptive psychiatry, or thinking about, miss the nimble active use of these clever hands. Empathic and much existential therapy is above all affective. The old-fashioned word corresponding to eye, head, or hand would be heart. The empathist feels. To the other schools, the existential enterprise seems lacking in sharpness and clear ideas of practicality, while the disease doctors, the analysts and the interpersonalists, to the existentialists seem to lack soul or heart. Perceiving, thinking, managing, feeling. Such are the specialties, we can say, of the schools. Together they comprise a full response to the patient and point forward to the integrated psychiatry still unborn. To assist that no doubt traumatic parturition, I want to suggest some ways by which the full use of ourselves might be ordered in psychotherapy. Now, I will do this within three categories: finding the patient and a working distance, dealing with defenses, and developing and managing transference. We will see that all three of these are at root one, that finding the patient means overcoming the defenses, which at once indicates and initiates the transference. And finding a working distance is also a way of saying the defenses are at least workable, and the transference neither anemic nor unmanageable. Making the distinctions is nevertheless useful because they can orient us at different points in the course of the work, and for a reason that will only become apparent, perhaps it will become apparent as this exposition proceeds. The focus of psychotherapy is being shifted in this exposition from teaching and making clear to a searching and making real. That's the heart of what I'm saying. The focus of this psychotherapy is in my view, being shifted from teaching and making clear to searching and making real. Now, the first of these sections is very, very repetitious since I've been over and over this, but let me just run through it quickly for those of you who weren't here when I did it first. I like to determine first whether the patient is moving toward me or away. Whether, for example, he is disappearing or even losing his mind. The presence of the patient's body in the room is no assurance of the presence of the patient's mind. I remind you, as I've never ceased to do, that a moment's reflection will convince you that lectures or discussions such as this one are made tolerable by the mind's capacity to be sent away to more important or more pleasurable places. And most of us can check back in occasionally to be sure that the exposition has not moved too far away. It's unlikely, anyway, that it's moved too far away. And all the while, our faces attend, even smile, don't they, as if our minds were actually here. As you've heard me say many times, this may be the most important personal freedom that people have, that is to send their minds away. Those who do not have it, those who are, we can say, prisoned in attention, lead lives hardly tolerable. Many are schizophrenic. And it may be that the mind is lost partly because it cannot be sent away. Under too much pressure for attention or obedience, we may break away. It may break away and be found talking to you from a corner of the room or your stomach and leaving behind that awful emptiness so common in psychotic states. Now, if you think being absent or lost is a metaphor or other literary device to describe the mind, recall that many minds are never again found or very incompletely found. Now, this very capacity to be prisoned and impinged upon reminds us of another property of mind. Mind can not only go away, it can invade. This was one of Freud's most startling discoveries. Parts of the mind are inaccessible or difficult of access, but others, equally unconscious in a different sense, are not only accessible but invasive. They come out and attach themselves to the therapist, distort the therapist, even change the therapist, as Searles has illuminated in such fascinating detail. See how quickly we have reached the problems of projective defenses and of psychotic transference. I wrote that the first task of the psychotherapist was to determine if the patient was receding or approaching. I think this is the first task because we cannot do our work if the patient is not in the room or if the patient is all over us. That statement, too, can be put in transference terms. If the patient is too far away, there will be a failure of transference development, as in many narcissistic states and catatonias. If the patient is too close, there may be unmanageable or psychotic transference, as in many conditions, including, of course, borderline states. If the patient is distant, psychotherapists have often thrown down their arms. A few have attempted to close the gap by literally moving closer. Residency, for example, put some of his patients on his lap. There were also the analytic therapists.
I forget what analytic means.
Well, it means that the patient leans against you. They're very close. I mean, there are people that would spend a great many hours with the patient, that they'd feed the patient. Some of them moved into the patient's bedroom. Whether you've ever read the autobiography of a schizophrenic girl by Sisha Hawa, account of that. It's been used in many conditions with very removed patients. It was at one time very popular in the treatment of anorexia nervosa, even at such a conservative institution as the Mass General. The psychological attack on the problem of distance began with the existentialists, in my view. Appropriately enough for a group intent on getting with the other, getting inside the skins of the other, right? And I've described, of course, in detail the steps in those technical developments, especially the phenomenological reduction and the development of what I call the forms of empathic speech. Very succinctly, existential method makes possible a going in search of, and perhaps surprisingly, it offers quite concrete tests of when the other is found. And you remember the two most useful of these tests of successful empathy are the ability to feel what the other is feeling and to complete inwardly what the other is saying. One reads off the dial of one's own reactions the extent of empathic closeness. Now, the problem of the invading patient is very different, of course. When I was a resident here in the 50s, Elizabeth Zetzel, who was then one of the two principal theoretical people in Boston, told us that invading patients could not be treated and that we should get out of the room, literally ourselves. In the work with what she called difficult hysterics, which overlaps with the borderline consumption, she recommended shortening the hour, reducing the number of sessions, above all, avoiding genetic and transference material. The problems were avoided by avoiding the patient. Ironically, there's a set of recommendations, also from analysis, precisely the opposite. My remarks occur Sunday morning, and then after I'm finished, Otto Kernberg talks, so I thought I'd put this in. Ironically, there is a set of recommendations, also from analysis, precisely the opposite. Otto Kernberg has taught us not to reduce our involvement, but to redouble it. Above all, to redouble the attack on difficult transference. This, of course, is to be done by very active interpretation. I like to visualize this process in his hands as a kind of swatting away or cutting away of the invasive transferences as they successively land on the therapist. If you've watched him work, it's really quite literally like that. However, for those of you fearful of exacerbating paranoid entanglements, or wherever hospital backup is not present, or if you happen to be without Kernberg's remarkable dexterity and facility, there is another resource. Sullivan's contemporary reputation was to a large extent based on his facility in resolving psychotic transference. He quite literally went about the land helping therapists out of these scrapes. 10 years ago, I took all these advices and anecdotes and tried to determine the principles of his interventions, something he had never done himself. The result was the description of types of interaction I call projective and counterprojective speech. Now, this is not an entirely new invention by any means. It has links with paradoxical intention that I've discussed here, Beck's cognitive therapy, to a variety of devices, including Kernberg's own recommendation of deflection treatment of borderline. Projective and counter-projective statements, however, represent a development and refinement of a basic interpersonal stance that is distancing and perspective giving. It is a formidable instrument for managing unmanageable transferences. It is, in different words, a means by which to establish a sound working distance when the problem is invasiveness. By a sound working distance, I mean a patient neither too close nor too far away. We cannot expect at the start of the work what is really the end point of treatment, the capacity to be alone together, neither to retreat nor to invade, but simply to accept and respect each other's presence. This is related to what Winnicott has called the child's capacity to be alone with its mother. We cannot expect that at the start, but we do need to find the patient and to establish a distance which makes psychotherapeutic work possible. Now, the second thing I want to talk about was the dealing with the defenses. Now, there's a paradox here, limited paradox. I mean, on the one hand, establishing a working distance makes work possible, but is itself a piece of work. For example, having established that working distance with a patient, it may be the first comfortable experience that the other person has ever had with someone, with a human being. So, in a sense, something has already, been significantly achieved. Now, let me see if I can recast that sort of claim in terms of the language of the defenses. Now, you won't be comfortable with me, or me with you, if I project too much on you. And I'll become uncomfortable in turn in the process, as I will be making you uncomfortable if I project too much on you. If I do that habitually, I'll be habitually uncomfortable. In other words, that's just simply another way of saying, in the language of the defenses, that I move into your mind, I presume things about what you're thinking, I project onto you, and that in the course of that, I make you uncomfortable, because as you know what it's like to be with a paranoid person, you feel your soul literally twisted and pulled, and you argue and retreat in an effort to manage that invasiveness. And on the other hand, something very similar happens with denial. Because if you're with someone who is doing a great deal of denial, it's as if a great deal of reality, at least as you perceive reality, has been left out of the relationship. And there are sort of lacunae in the course of the relationship which make you uncomfortable. For example, the patient's reaction to events is incomplete, or their account of events is incomplete. And you find yourself with the experience that people often have when they step off a stair and it's a little deeper than they thought it was. There isn't a smooth kind of movement with the patient because of these gaps that denial makes in the interaction. The patient, too, is uncomfortable in the sense that not only a great deal of energy is probably being expended to preserve that denial, but also there is a kind of vacancy and distance which is introduced by this process of putting away, if you like. It's also obvious that in patients that are heavily introjected, that is, are under heavy attack from introjects, the discomfort with another person is very powerful. Not only because they are very likely to project their introject and think you are criticizing them as their introjects are. But they, even without that experience of external criticism, they are under such constant attack within themselves that they can simply not comfortably relate to anyone. Because as the conversation demands from them, say, statements about something, and they make those statements, and they find their introjects are criticizing the statements they've made, they're not only dealing with you, they're dealing with this sort of fifth columnist that's interrupting the smooth flow of their relationship with you. And you in turn find yourself distorted by talking to somebody who's in that condition because you don't know why they should be so self-critical. And you don't like being sort of lined up as a critic of them. Nor are you comfortable with not knowing why it is they should put themselves down, interrupt themselves, correct themselves in the course of a conversation where you have essentially not initiated that kind of critical activity. Now, and if you have initiated that critical activity, then the conversation becomes smoother. And very often you feel better when you're with a person who does a great deal of interjection once you're caught up in the system and then can criticize them the way you're supposed to. And unfortunately, part of our psychotherapeutic work plays heavily into that, because if we find out we think there's something wrong with a depressed person, we then join them in their insight about what's wrong with them. And the clinical transaction goes on much more comfortably because there is now a coherence between the interject, you, and the patient. An agreement about the sickness, so to speak. But up until that's arrived at, conversation with heavily interjected people is uncomfortable. So I'm now taking up what is obviously not a systematic account of psychotherapy, but an attempt to talk about the interventions I've been presenting in a more orderly way, now under the heading of the defenses. Now, without being able to satisfy myself anyway as to why it is, it seems to me that what's so striking about empathic work is its effect on denial. And that mystifies me a little, although it seems like it ought to be sort of self-understanding or self-evident. And yet it doesn't seem quite so. But we can say that by placing yourself with some part of a person's mental life, one may then draw out, so to speak, something which has been held in denial. And I've suggested a process that might serve as a prototype of that. And remember, I discussed it under what I call the heading of no wonder statements. When I say to the patient, well, no wonder you feel so dreadful, right? I'm essentially placing myself in between an event and a feeling. And up until now, although the patient was conscious of the event and the feeling, the connection between them was in denial. That is, they didn't know why they felt badly, even though they knew that something had happened. And you see this very, very commonly, and particularly late life depressions, where the person will say they feel dreadful, and then you'll find out in the course of a routine sort of history taking that just a week or so ago their husband died. And you're astonished why it isn't, you wonder why they don't somehow make that connection. I mean, it may not be the cause of their depression. The husband may have died out of sheer ennui from living with a depressed person. Those are all possibilities, but it really is still a mystery as to why the patient doesn't make that possible connection. It would seem like the kind of thing the mind would seize on. And yet, we all know, it's almost, in fact, it's almost pathognomonic, if anything's pathognomonic, in psychiatry, of an involutional depression, to find that the patient simply doesn't mention the catastrophe while they do mention their feeling. And we call that denial. The same thing is present, perhaps even more flamboyantly, in manic states, when the person's, say, pennilessness or bankruptcy is completely unmentioned, while instead there's put in its place all kinds of grandiose delusions. But the example from late life depressions is certainly plain enough. And the power of no wonder statements is that by saying no wonder, that is, by saying that no wonder you feel depressed, you essentially place yourself down in between the event and the feeling. And as that putting oneself down in between the event and the feeling is repeated, you can often draw the event and the feeling together until it becomes no wonder in the patient's mind as well. And I've suggested that the power of those statements to break down denial is based not simply on their repetitiveness or on the connection that you're established, but on the fact that, it seems to me, the fact that you are with the patient and sharing their feelings at the moment they look at the event. So that instead of having to face what may have been a catastrophic event alone, and therefore to deny it, perhaps, defensively deny it, you are with them in seeing the event and naturalizing or sharing the feelings that arise from the event. That mechanism seems to me fundamental in the theory of empathy, and nicely explains, it seems to me, why empathy seems particularly related to the defensive of denial. So every now and then a patient will bring this dramatically to your attention. In fact, that's how the idea occurred to me, because a patient brought this to my attention. That is that having inadvertently done that with a patient who was denying, the patient made the remark to me that if she had had someone to discuss the event with at the time it had happened, perhaps she wouldn't have had to pretend it didn't happen. And so now empathy is being seen as a sort of second chance, if you like, in the matter of digesting an experience and not denying the relationship between the feelings that arise and the event itself. Notice how nice that is in terms of its particularity. That is, it has to be an empathy, i.e. you have to be with the person as they share the feeling in the event if you are really going to make up for their previous aloneness confronting the same feelings and events. That isn't going to do to talk about the thing. You have to be with them in that experience.
The part of what they're denying is their loneliness, along with the trauma of the event.
If they're even denying their loneliness, well, that's the kind of problem you encounter in mania, isn't it? You obviously don't encounter it in depression, do you? Because there the person is depressed, alone, forlorn, right? But it is true, and I remember, when you were here, when I discussed once why no wonder statements don't work in mania, because it is a wonder. The wonder is how they can, not feel what they should. And I've suggested another way to approach that, which is, this isn't as effective as my experience says. There's no wonder business. So that points to a perhaps specific connection between empathy and in a sort of schematic summary where he contrasts psychoanalytic process with existential process. And you remember he says that in the sort of the basic model of psychopathology analysis, the drive, the forbidden drive, is repressed. And that in its reemergence, the symptoms occur. That's the model. While in the existential experience, a drive is not repressed, an event is repressed, or in this case, denied. And so that it's such a devastating and painful, if not pathetic, illustration of our sectarianism, that those two processes, which are both very likely and common and useful to know about, are seen as exclusive in that otherwise intelligent book. And you remember, as he goes on, as Yalom goes on in his very careful summary of the themes of existential work, he mentions the different things that existentialism has discovered people are likely to deny. And remember, there's chapters on death, for example, meaninglessness and groundlessness and blah, blah, blah. In other words, they're things about the world. They're things about the experience of the world as opposed to one's drive relationship to it that constitute the thing to be denied. And of course, the list is actually endless. He just takes the main headings and thinks the things that people have sort of primordially denied, like death. But in fact, one can deny anything. I mean, one will need to deny anything in order to sort of go about one's business. But obviously the book couldn't consist of sort of everything that ever happened in human history, although that's in fact what it could consist of, because at one time or another, you could bet your life somebody needed to deny it. If only because there were more than one of those things coming at them at once. Anyway, so that it seems to me the relationship between sharing empathy, the unbearable, and denial, all that seems to makes a sort of logical pie.
Can I ask a question?
I think so. Well, it isn't too difficult.
I'm sure that you had mentioned this at some point, and I guess I need you to elaborate on it. That there seems to be another link between being empathic and having a patient respond to that. That sometimes you can be as empathic as you've ever been in your life, and there's no response. It's as if there's some link that's missing.
Right.
And I'm wondering what that is.
Well, that's a very important. Caveat, you might say. And it's one, and it's an observation that we've all made, in the course of our experience, often to our great frustration. Another way of saying it is that although we may reach out for someone, we may not find them. Well, there are many reasons we don't find them, all of which you know or would guess at. One, sometimes we just are not reaching for the right thing. But other times we are reaching for the right thing, and we don't get to it. And there are lots of reasons, I'm sure, for that. But one of the ones that I'm calling attention to in this kind of presentation is the fact that as we may reach for the person, they may retreat further. And like all reaching, it may not reach. I know when I mentioned this patient to one or two of you before, when I first arrived here, the hospital was in the grip of a program to lobotomize as many patients as possible. Lobotomy is a cut that's made between the frontal lobes and the thalamus in one way or another, in many ways. Down in Alan Hobson's laboratory in the now the door marked neurophysiology was the operating room of the hospital. If you strip back Alan's expensive carpets, you'll find underneath there tiles, as is the custom in creating bathrooms and operating rooms. And in that room, little holes were made here in patients' heads, and their connections to the frontal lobes, the thalamus in part, were severed. And I mention that because one of the things we did as residents was to try to save the patients from this process, even though it was the purpose of the superintendent of the hospital to achieve as many of these lobotomies as possible, because he was writing a book, which, as we all know, is a very important therapeutic process at Harvard and other fancy institutions, the one which I'm indulging myself. When I had a woman come to me who was assigned to me, was from Springfield, and she was remarkable because she was, first of all, very dirty, and second of all, very naked, and thirdly, most dramatic of all, was the fact that she was gnawing on her toenails, which is something that isn't so easy to do, especially if you're overweight. And well, I was, in those days, Elvin Semrad used to come up on the ward 3 times a week, and so we were all trying to be empathic, imitating him. And I tried to be empathic with Georgia Romeliadis from Springfield. One of the difficulties I had was that she wouldn't come into the office. She used to walk, hide away somewhere when I wanted her. And then the next 2 or 3 months, she'd walk back and forth in front of the door. But my empathy didn't reach very far. Probably still doesn't, but it certainly didn't reach out in the hall. And finally she came in, and then she was so disgusting I didn't feel very empathic for a long time, and I either got worn down or she washed herself up or something, and I began to make empathic remarks. Probably not very appropriate ones, but anyway. It took a long time to find her. I eventually did find her, as a matter of fact. She did quite well, even without her lobotomy. Although she was always a somewhat eccentric lady in my mind. But that's a model for what I think you would, at least I've always experienced, and perhaps others more skillful don't, but with schizophrenic people, particularly catatonic people, and she was very catatonic, with whom you try to do empathic work. That is, you go on in the dark for many months, and then eventually you begin to get little blips back from the darkness, and the patient will say to you things that you've said to them. Maybe they just learned the words, but it doesn't seem like that. And then they will begin to express some of the feelings you think that they've been experiencing. And I've had enough really dramatic evidences of that, where indeed you recover the feeling of the patient. but that you have to work in the darkness. I assume because they're so distant, so heavily defended, so much denied, that no matter what you do or how much you think you understand, it takes a long time to get through.
Well, I needed to hear you say the word retreat. I think that explains it for me. Because I know there's times when I have felt that I've hit where the patient is, and they haven't responded. They must have moved, they must have retreated.
Yeah, when you say they haven't responded, you said it was that like with a blank wall, or something happened, that it wasn't that they came closer.
Well, we're talking about denying that what I'm saying is what is actually true.
I don't think they even hear you. I mean, I think what you say falls as much under the denial as what they're feeling. There hasn't been a great deal of talk in the recent literature, particularly the recent literature of hallucinations, about what it was once a commonplace to mention, although it was more a startling thing than it was a commonplace to observe. And that is negative hallucinations. But many schizophrenic people do have negative hallucinations. That is, they simply don't just see something there. They just don't see anything at all in place of the object, or don't hear. You usually think of that kind of deafness and visual blocking out as hysterical. But that also occurs in people that most individuals would agree were schizophrenic on occasion.
Nowadays we know that it doesn't have anything to do with the universal situation, whether it's probably a slow virus or some sort of thing more in people in the limbic system. The cause of this thing, so it's probably passé to even discuss this. And I wanted to venture out and just say...
That wouldn't stop you, David, right? A few retroviruses there.
Have to kick a few chairs. I wanted to say that I'm curious how often it's because I think Simrad said we're drunk, that we can't reach them, or that we're not aware, or they're not aware, or we're not aware that they're aware that we're in there together because of the powerful tranquilizers that we snowed with while we're waiting around for them to come back. I wonder how you feel about the use of neuroleptics in those states and whether or not they impede the work. Let alone do it for us.
Well, I think it depends upon how much neuroleptic is used. I don't think, unless the patient is very, very heavily snowed, it makes, in my experience, a great deal of difference. I think it should make more difference than it appears to from a theoretical point of view. I think if the person is really paralyzed, zombie-ized, etc., then I'm sure it makes no difference.
Catatonia, I mean, wasn't it, I mean, the whole, that your empathic statements falling on deaf ears, the denial was, that was what catatonia was all about, was
Denial. Denial of death, by the way, the old teaching. Patient would, I'm trying not to denial of death, the conviction of being dead, denial of life. So the old teaching as to what the mental content of catatonia was. Patients thought they were dead. They had no life. Whether that's really denial or not, or whether that's a statement, a sort of metaphor for their condition, is an interesting question. I interrupt you, David. I went off on my own there.
I wonder how you put empathic work in the context of family situations. Just like doing prison business today, and I had a case where I feel like I was doing empathic work with the young woman. And I'm hearing a lot of things from her that are very negative things about her father. And I can align with that. The other side I haven't heard is the positive things she has. And now we're faced with the hospital saying she's got to go, you're in the room, and she's going to be put back into the family environment. Could you use your empathic work in the context of a family situation?
Oh, yeah.
How do you empathize with someone
Well, I don't mean any general formula for that. Complicated matter. Notice how the empathic stance is in some ways ideal for the patient who leaves the hospital, in a sense, because that insofar as your empathy is successful, it's never, terribly successful. Insofar as it's successful, you then go with them,
She said just that.
so that they are not going home alone under those circumstances. And that seems to me, I can think of many illustrations where that has been a decisive thing in the person's capacity to manage at home. And to me, it's most evident when in married couples, where a woman, particularly, because it's more common that women are sort of oppressed in marriages, I think, than men, although both, of course, but that women will have had to deny the nature of their husband's behavior toward them. And as you are with them in the perception of the husband's reality, as they take you home, so to speak, to look at the reality of the husband's behavior, your being with them in validating their own perception and enlarging their perception makes it possible for them to see what the husband is doing. Now you might say that's what I call that the principle of acknowledgement, and I give it a fancy name because it never ceases to amaze me how effective that is by itself. You would have thought that might disorganize the person. Isn't it better to live not knowing what he's really like? I mean, in a fool's paradise. Well, I'm sure there are situations where that's true, but in what I've seen of it, isn't it all the case? That in fact what he does occurs whether you admit it or not. And that the thing that you gain by noticing it is that it validates the feelings that are set up in you, which otherwise are unintelligible. So that his behavior is just as destructive insofar as it affects you directly, but no longer do you have the experience of wondering why you respond that way. So that when you don't know why you're mad, you are not only mad, but you're also confused. And the being with, the overcoming of the denial, with having you at home against the husband, so to speak, or to look at the husband, serves as a way of preventing the confusion. I'm sure we could all think of examples, other examples.
It's like what you don't know can hurt you.
Yeah.
But if there's somebody there to help protect you.
What you don't know can't hurt you
It's a false statement.
is a false statement, yeah.
Yeah, but it's the assumption in the cliche that underlies things going on.
I think that's a statement commonly made by authorities, to dupe younger people, students, residents, wives, other subordinate people, into not asking the wrong questions. Don't you think that's what it is? What you don't know won't hurt you. You know the kind of people that say that. And they look you in the eye. And that's what the head of the CIA says to the senatorial committee. What you fellows don't know won't hurt you. Well, maybe there's some truth to it. I don't mean to sell denial short. I've been trying to make a case for the I think the self-evident idea that denial makes life worth living. You go to enough conferences on a nuclear bomb threat, for example, and you know what I mean.
Something concerned about what Al says, though, and I wonder about, is it sort of brings back that classic analytic defense that if the patient doesn't accept the interpretation they're resisting, it doesn't raise the possibility that the interpretation is wrong.
Right.
And that if we say if the patient doesn't respond to our empathy, it means the patient is denying it.
Sure.
It feels that it could become a little dangerous.
Oh, well, I agree. That's a terribly important thing now. But that's sort of the name of the medical game. That's the risk we undertake when we do our thing, whatever it is, right?
That sounds like what they don't know under the say
Well-
that's the name of the medical.
Well, I mean, I'm not justifying it, but it's inevitable. You know, you go in, you operate, you make a decision in the left lower quadrant, and you should have been in the head. You know?
Somewhere around the temples. But isn't it?
But that's right. I mean, all these things will become formulas that you apply. And in fact, that you're not doing the right thing at all. Right? Or maybe you shouldn't be doing anything at all.
I guess, I mean, the way that another way I think about it, non-responsiveness empathy, is that there's rarely one right empathic statement. It may be that you're mourning the loss of a loved one is
Right.
where the person is at, but what's more important at that point is you don't trust me. And that I may make the accurate statement, you're mourning a loss, and the patient may jump back, and it's not because I was wrong, but because there was enough other
What,
things going on.
what concerns me is this idea that there's a response that you expect from your empathy. I mean, like, there's a correct response and an incorrect response, or one that, I mean, I can see using your own your own feelings as a gauge of successful empathy or not, but it's hard for me to imagine a response that the patient makes or doesn't make as any kind of measure of the usefulness or lack of usefulness of empathy.
Well, it's in a matter of time. You expect something. You just
You'd like something to happen with you, David.
Yeah. I don't know, it's just maybe calling it a response, though.
Yeah.
Failure response,
That's
failure
right.
to respond. Just, I don't know.
It's
Just
so hard not to push people around.
It brings up the question, I think, of where the action is. And that's kind of a question I have for you, which is you can use empathic statements and you can sort of know that somebody's denying something. But if you don't go where the action is, it doesn't do you any good. So you can make an empathic statement, but the person's going to back off and it's going to be in the middle of nowhere, and they'll back off. But where the action is maybe saying something like, well, I could say something, but you probably wouldn't really like me to say it anyway. So that how do you can locate somebody, and you can see whether they're in the room or not in the room, and then try to locate them and throw out some stuff to sort of and do some marking, see where there are mark faults and stuff. But the question is sort of focus, where how do you get a sense of where the action is?
Well, you're not. Remember, I said that I was hoping that we could shift sort of the model of the work from learning and making clear to searching and making real. And to me, that's fundamental, because you never find a person. You're damn lucky if you find an idea or a feeling. In fact, it may even be impossible to find another human. I mean, if you were to find them, in the process of finding them, they'd be different already. And they will always elude us. And I think that's the better answer to the point you're making. That if you really think and takes in what other David was saying, if you ever think that there's some way that you can get the person sort of laid out in the lavender, that's not the name of the game.
Well, I'm not going to let you away with that. I think that because I was talking about something very specific, and I think we got to go back to that there are times, and I know it's been my experience, and I think it's been everybody's experience here, that there are rare times, unfortunately, that you really do feel what the patient feels, and you can complete their sentences. You know what they're going to say, and then something happens. I like that you said they retreated.
I think that does sometimes. But one of the things you have to look forward to, I think, is an increasing strength of capacity in that regard. I mean, an increasing accuracy of capacity. One of the things that I bet many of you feel, particularly if you keep at this work, because a lot of people don't, but if you keep at this work, if you enjoy it, that you will find yourself in this continues to surprise me greatly. You will find yourself, after a while, no longer often surprised. I don't think that's simply a matter of a gradual adrenal rundown or something, or general loss of responsiveness in general, but a real sense of an increased range of receptiveness.
But I think you can find the patient.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. I think in the absence of that surprise, it's by no means conclusive, but in the absence of that surprise, I think it means that for the most part you're pretty close to them anyway. I take that as one of my main signs that I'm off base, is when I'm surprised. And that's really saying the same thing over again, because if you know what someone's going to say, you're obviously not surprised. But the experience of surprise is a very discrete thing with someone, and indicates for the most part that you've missed them. I have a patient that I sit with, and I've known him for 2 years now, and I'm a very high regard for him, but most of the time I've been with him, I've been on the edge of my seat, because I really don't think I know what's going to happen next. He's very removed. He retreats. He also advances very quickly, but he retreats very rapidly. And he comes from a segment of our culture which is by definition alienated, disengaged. And he's finding it very hard to believe that I might have some sort of feeling for where he is that was not judgmental. And he's quite right to be concerned. And in many ways, I'm rather glad that he has kept himself so far away, because I suspect that if he'd brought himself closer any faster, he might have found out that he was right. And that only by he's extraordinarily tactful man. He's had to take care of a couple of real weirdo parents all his life. And he's remarkable at taking care of me, in looking after me. And I think one of the signs of that custodianship of me, although he pays me a considerable amount of money, that custodianship of me was that he did not put me to the test before I was ready. So he was in retreat, but all the time while I was doing it, I was not at ease.
Do you acknowledge that in the project?
Well, I haven't with him, although I suspect he knows it. But I haven't with him because I was so afraid that if I were to tell him I was ill at ease, he would redouble his efforts to please me. And I try not to burden him with that. I really thought, although I was obviously unequipped to do it, that it was my responsibility to help take care of him. And yet he seemed so much better able to take care of me and to know where I was, that I just sort of had to wait around and hope I'd get better. And I have gotten a lot better. And he's gotten a lot better at the same time. A lot better. He was very suicidal for a year and a half. And he's no longer so suicidal. And he's been able to have the first love in his life and to really work to it. But it was always surprising.
So you were afraid that you might open up?
Well, I was terrible. I thought, it wasn't as if I was holding him up. I couldn't let him know. I didn't know where he was. And he's not catatonic or schizophrenic. It was a very deliberate holding back. It wasn't what the existentialists call the rule of the must, M-U-S-T. He didn't have to go away. He just decided it was much in his better interest. And I think
in conclusion, maybe this is clear from the beginning, one conclusion I can point out is that empathy, you're proposing that empathy has a restorative
integrative,
quality to it.
Restore the dissociated, if you like. Integrate the dissociated.
But then I recall from a few weeks ago, at the end of the session, we can get back to you, make a comment that the notion of a corrected emotional experience is a
balance.
Yeah, well, I blow hot and cold on that. The reason I say that is that the general way, and there are a number of ways in which the expression is used, but the general way, as used by Franz Alexander, was that the therapist needed to make allowances in his behavior in the direction of correcting the transference, the role play. Remember, his famous example was of the patient who expected the therapist to be very angry and authoritarian like his father. And Alexander went out of his way to be kindly and friendly. Now, that's something we all do, and it has a place in the work. I don't want to go too much. But there's something systematically wrong with it. And that is that if our work is also transference development, then we are severely limited in our capacity to do that, because insofar as we do that, we forestall the development of transference. That's why I talk about transference management, transference correction. Now, in fact, it doesn't work out that way, because we're not so benign anyway, so it does develop. I'm making more theoretical. But there is a sort of a corrective emotional experience. That's not even talk about extinction in terms of extinguishing certain learned responses, which is certainly a corrective experience. So I probably overdo my quarrel with that. But I'm a little embarrassed to be associated with something which is role playing. That may be my problem, because I'm really kind of a role player myself. Maybe that's why I'm embarrassed. And I've even tried to turn it upside down and saying it's counter role playing. You're countering a role that's assigned to you.
Well, if the transference is an active re-experiencing of unconscious or childhood
Remember, I keep interrupting you, but let me add something. It isn't just a re-experience. It's a recreating. Okay? I mean, I really mean this when I say the mind is invasive. It isn't that the patient misperceives you. That occurs. The patient distorts you to act in such a way as to fulfill that expectation. That's the claim I'm making. And
operational justification, but from the patient's point of view, they are experiencing you as the once again, and I wonder, and from a third or therapist, there was a recreation or a creation. Anyways, the question is sort of about, in terms of a corrective emotional experience, as opposed to the emphasis being on corrective and emotional, if it's on the word experience. In other words, doesn't there something that's got to take place?
Something has to take place, right?
And
that's what I call making real. I mean,
with this guy that you were describing, that it's as though he was waiting for the time when it could take place.
Yeah, without really making that conscious decision.
Yeah.
Right.
I have a question somewhat lodged in all that, but I don't really. How do you understand that? I mean, that he's waiting for the moment when it is okay for him to recreate this thing, and then he's testing out whether or not you can adequately play.
Well, perhaps, but you see, it may be that he's doing exactly the thing to me that I'm suggesting we do to him. That is, he's waiting for the time when I'm enough there so that I don't have to deny what's true about him. And then as the two of us sort of work toward some kind of contact, the possibility of his having a new kind of experience with somebody emerges.
And because you presented this very formula, I think, from the therapist, groping towards a rendezvous,
uneasy. I
Yeah.
lost my way. You know, did I take the wrong train? There's a place there where we're supposed to meet. I had some sort of directions, you know, but I got them wrong. You know, and there are 2 Mayhew streets anyway. Where could it be?
Maybe that's really what finding a patient is. It's not that you find the patient, but that you arrive at the same place.
Yeah.
And you know the patient's moods.
But you know, I
such
prefer.
that you can put yourself into mood.
Yeah, but I prefer, you know, the analogy I prefer is the one about the bus. Because it isn't as if there is a place. The fact is the place, the place. The fact is the place, the place. The fact is the place, the place.